At the Grand Joseon dinner hall, a woman told the most feared man in 4 states that he was blocking her light. The Grand Joseon was the kind of restaurant that didn't need a sign outside. It occupied the top 2 floors of a glass tower on Peachtree Road, and on any given Thursday night, the decisions made at its tables quietly rearranged the architecture of power across Georgia, the Carolinas, and the Upper Gulf Corridor. Kang Jae-won had owned it for 9 years. Not on paper. On paper it belonged to a hospitality holding company incorporated in Delaware that traced back through 3 shells to a dead end in Singapore. But everyone in that room understood the difference between who owned something on paper and who owned something in the way that actually mattered, in the way that meant your table was always ready and you never saw a check. He sat at the center table because the center of a room is simultaneously the most exposed position and the most powerful one, and Jae-won had long ago decided that he would rather be seen clearly than hidden imperfectly. He wore a suit the color of midnight, no tie, shirt open at the collar, which on another man might have read as casual. On him it read as a deliberate signal, "I am not performing formality for you because I don't need to." Across the table, Salvador Castillo was performing formality enough for both of them. Castillo was the capo of the Piedmont family, a man whose territory covered a 100-mile stretch of I-85 corridor that Jae-won had wanted for 2 years, and was about to acquire either through negotiation or through the kind of alternative that turned properties into crime scenes. Castillo knew both options were on the table. He had been talking for 11 minutes. He would have talked forever if it meant delaying the moment when Kang Jae-won opened his mouth and made a decision. Jae-won was not listening. He was aware of Castillo the way you're aware of background music, present, registered, filed. But his attention had been pulled out from under him by something he didn't yet have a name for, and it had happened in the space between one breath and the next. She was sitting at a small circular table near the velvet-draped windows that looked out over the glittering spine of Buckhead at night, and she was absolutely, entirely, magnificently alone. In a room full of people who were performing power, performing wealth, performing calm, she was doing none of those things. She was just there. Present in some fundamental way that made everyone else in the room look like they were auditioning for something. Her skin was the color of deep espresso, luminous under the warm glow of the brass chandeliers, and she wore a dress of liquid gold that moved when she moved and caught light the way precious things do, not by demanding attention but by simply being what they are. Her hair was natural, a full crown that framed her face like something deliberate and regal. She had the bearing of a woman who had never in her adult life arranged herself for someone else's comfort. And she was peeling a grape. Not dramatically. Not in a performative way. She was peeling a grape with focused precision, her attention completely divided between this task and the book propped against her water glass, as though the grape and the book were the only things in the room worth her focus, and everything else, the 50 power brokers, the 12 bodyguards, the ambient hum of fear that Jae-won generated just by existing in a space, was background noise she had already evaluated and dismissed. Jae-won's glass stopped halfway to his lips. This was the moment. This was the exact, specific moment that his consigliere Dominic Yoon would later describe as the first crack in the dam. Not a flood. Not a collapse. A crack. The kind that looks small from the outside and is catastrophic in everything that follows. Dominic was half black and half Korean, raised in both languages and neither tradition fully, which meant he operated with the particular cultural bilingualism of a man who understood exactly what was happening on both sides of any given situation and was exhausted by all of it. He'd been with Jae-won for 11 years. He had seen him negotiate, threaten, strategize, and destroy with equal and terrifying efficiency. He had never, in 11 years, seen him stop mid-sentence in the middle of a business meeting because a woman was reading a book. Jae-won, Dominic murmured, leaning close enough that his voice wouldn't carry. Castillo is waiting. 22% of the Piedmont route is on the table. This is the number we wanted. Jae-won said nothing. His glass was still in the air. Kyung. The Korean word for older brother, which had evolved over 11 years into something that didn't map cleanly onto organizational charts. What are you looking at? Jae-won set down his glass. He stood up. The sound of his chair on the marble was a crack of sound in a room that had been holding its breath without knowing it. Every head turned. Castillo's face went to chalk. Bodyguards along the perimeter moved their hands to their holsters in the automatic, muscle memory way of men who've trained themselves to respond to sudden movement as a threat. Dominic grabbed the edge of the table and for the first time in 11 years looked like he might actually have a stroke. Hyung. But Jae-won was already moving. He moved through that room like a man who had just remembered what he was starving for. Not the hunger that makes you desperate, but the worst kind, the hunger that makes you finally, at last, honest. He cut a straight line across the hall, shouldered a server out of the path without a glance, and a silver tray of mote hit the marble like a detonation. Crystal everywhere. The server, to his great credit, said nothing. Nobody said anything. He reached her table and stopped. He stood there, 6 feet of tailored black silk and the specific silence of a man who is used to rooms organizing themselves around him, and cast a shadow directly across the open pages of her book. Susan Williams did not flinch. She finished peeling her grape. Ate it. Turned a page. And then, with the unhurried grace of someone who simply does not recognize urgency as her problem, tilted her face upward. Her eyes were dark and clear and achingly intelligent, and they looked at him with an expression that could only be described as the polite, slightly bored patience of a woman waiting for a mildly interesting thing to say something mildly interesting. "You're blocking my light," she said. Her voice was a low contralto, smooth and warm and unhurried, the kind of voice that belonged in a jazz club on Auburn Avenue at 2 in the morning, or in a lecture hall at Spelman where brilliant women made other brilliant people feel slightly inadequate for their own good. It landed in the center of Jae-won's chest like something that had always belonged there and was only now arriving. Behind him, his empire was quietly having a breakdown. Castillo was exchanging glances with his own men, the kind of glances that said, "Do we move? Is this a power play we don't understand? Or is Kang Jae-won losing his mind in real time?" 3 rival family representatives in the room were recalibrating in real time. His own lieutenants were stone still, hands visible, operating in a space where they had no instructions because there was no protocol in any manual or tradition for this particular situation. "Who are you?" Jae-won asked. His voice came out raw. Not aggressive, not calculated, not the controlled cold rasp that had made senators nervous and federal investigators drink more than they should. Just raw. Like something that had been sealed for a long time had just been unsealed with no warning. Susan tilted her head slightly, the way someone does when they're deciding whether a question deserves the full answer or just enough of it. "Someone who was enjoying her dinner," she said. "And you?" Her eyes moved over him once, a single assessment pass that was unhurried and entirely without performance, "are a man who looks like he's forgotten how to breathe." She gestured to the chair across from her with 2 fingers, the precise motion of someone who has decided to deal with the situation in front of them simply because it is in front of them and life is short. "Sit down. You're making everyone in this room nervous. And frankly, you're starting to make me nervous, and I don't do nervous." Kang Jae-won sat down. He sat down at a woman's table without permission or precedent, in the middle of a $43 million negotiation, with 100 people watching, and he did not care. Not about the optics. Not about the money. Not about Castillo, who was going to need a new shirt after tonight. Not about Dominic, who was somewhere behind him in the quiet agony of a man watching a controlled demolition he cannot stop. He leaned forward across the table. His hand, the one that had signed death warrants and business contracts with equal steadiness, reached out across the white tablecloth. Not to take. Not to threaten. Just to touch the edge of her gold sleeve, the way a man reaches for something he's not entirely sure is real. "I haven't forgotten how to breathe," he said, quietly. His eyes on hers. Not performing. Not calculating. Just there, in the most unguarded way he had been in 17 years, "I think I just started." Susan Williams looked at his hand on her sleeve. Then at him. A long, clear, considering look. She didn't pull away. And that single, small, devastating decision, was the beginning of everything. Hi. Besties, where are you watching from and what time are you watching? Kindly, sit tight and grab your popcorn because this is where this story is getting more interesting. Kindly, subscribe to this channel and turn on your notification bell so that you can keep getting more mind-blowing stories on channel. Let's ride on. Her name was Dr. Susan Williams, and she was, as it turned out, a professor of African diaspora literature at Spelman College, the author of 2 critically acclaimed books that neither Jae-won nor anyone in his organization had read because, and this is relevant, none of them had been operating in an environment that prioritized critically acclaimed books about diaspora literature. She was 34 years old. She had grown up in Southwest Atlanta, the daughter of a high school principal father and a nurse practitioner mother who had raised her to be excellent without apology and unimpressed without rudeness, and she had achieved both with spectacular success. She was at the Grand Josian that Thursday night because a colleague, another professor, an economist named Dr. Kwame Asante, had made a dinner reservation and then been called away for a family emergency, and had insisted Susan take the reservation because the restaurant had a 6-month wait list and the lamb chops were, apparently, transcendent, and life was short and the lamb chops were real. She had brought a book because she was a woman who always brought a book, and because she was eating alone and unapologetic about it. She had noticed Kang Jae-won the moment she sat down. She was not, despite the clear-eyed performance of disinterest, oblivious. She was highly perceptive, which is different. She had clocked the room in 2 minutes, the bodyguards, the hierarchy of tables, the quality of fear that the men near the center table were performing as calm, and the tall man at the center of all of it who hadn't moved a muscle since she arrived but whose stillness had a specific texture. The stillness of something that doesn't need to move to be dangerous. She had made a decision, in the 37 seconds it took to assess all of this, that she was going to eat her lamb chops and read her book and leave without any of it touching her. That decision lasted about 40 minutes, right up until the moment it didn't. They talked for 2 hours. This, more than anything else, more than the crossed line, more than the abandoned negotiations, more than the fact that Jae-won essentially set $43 million on fire by leaving that table, this was what nobody who knew him could process. Kang Jae-won didn't talk. He transacted. He negotiated. He instructed. Occasionally, when the situation required it, he threatened. But he did not sit across a table from a woman he'd met 45 minutes ago and talk for 2 hours about James Baldwin and the Korean concept of Han, that deep, untranslatable sorrow woven into a people's bones, and the way grief functions differently across cultures but lands in the same place in the body every single time. He did, though. He did exactly that. And she matched him. Not performed matching, actually met him, thought for thought, held her positions with a quiet certainty that didn't require volume, pushed back on his ideas with the particular precision of someone who respects an argument enough to dismantle it properly. She was funny in a way that caught him off guard, dry and sharp with a timing that landed before he saw it coming, which almost never happened to him. She asked him what he did and he said, finance, in the way men in his world say finance, which is a complete sentence that is also a closed door, and she looked at him with those clear, knowing eyes and said, sure, in a tone that indicated she was aware that finance was a closed door and had simply filed that information for later. He asked for her number before the lamb chops arrived for her second order. She considered it for what felt like a very long time and was actually 6 seconds. She gave it to him. He texted her before he reached his car. Not playing a game, not waiting the calculated hours that signal disinterest, just texted her immediately because the calculation he usually ran, what impression does this create, what leverage does this generate, had simply stopped processing. The text said, the Baldwin argument. You were wrong. She replied 12 minutes later, I'm a published academic on this exact subject. You're a finance man. Explain to me mathematically why I'm wrong. He didn't sleep that night. Now, Here is what you need to understand about what was at stake, because this is not a story about two people falling into something soft and easy. This is a story about what happens when the thing you fall into is detonating in slow motion and you decide to keep falling anyway. Kang Jae-won was not just a dangerous man in a general sense. He was a specific kind of dangerous, the kind built on a foundation of strategic invisibility. His power existed because his personal life did not. He had no relationships that could be leveraged. No attachments that could be found. No softness that could be reached and used as a pressure point. This was not accidental. It was architecture. 17 years of deliberate construction, every personal connection filed away, every potential vulnerability removed before it could form. In his world, the moment someone knew who you loved, they had the blueprint for your destruction. And he had just walked across a full dinner hall in front of every rival family on the eastern seaboard and sat uninvited at a woman's table like a man in a romantic comedy who had completely forgotten he was in a crime drama. Dominic came to find him in the parking garage, after Castillo had been handled, a deal eventually signed at 24%, Castillo sweating through the paperwork, and sat in the passenger seat of Jae-won's car without being invited, which was itself a measure of how serious things were, because Dominic Yoon had very carefully maintained the habit of waiting to be invited into everything in Jae-won's life for 11 years. "Tell me you understand what just happened in there," Dominic said. The Castillo deal closed at 24. "I'm not talking about Castillo." Jae-won was quiet. "3 families saw you," Dominic said. "Bianchi's people. The Park group from Charlotte. Reyes." He let that sit for a moment. "They saw you lose your concentration over a woman. They saw you leave a negotiation table mid-sentence. They don't know who she is yet, but they're going to find out because that's what they do, and when they do." "I know." Jae-won. Dominic. "Nanun algo idio." "I know. I know what it means. I know what it costs." He paused. "I'm going to call her tomorrow." Dominic was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "Okay." Not agreement. Not endorsement. Just the recognition, from a man who knew him better than anyone, that this particular conversation was over and a different, longer, more complicated one had just begun. He called her the next morning. She was in her office at Spelman, between her 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock classes, eating a breakfast sandwich and editing student papers with the focused ferocity of a woman who takes other people's intellectual development personally. She picked up on the third ring. "I looked up your argument about go tell it on the mountain," he said, instead of hello. "Good morning to you too. You were still wrong. Name a single peer-reviewed source that supports your position." "I don't need peer review. I need logic." She laughed. It was a short, genuine sound, not performed for his benefit, and it hit him somewhere in the chest like a second crack in the dam. "Okay, finance man," she said. "Logic me." They were on the phone for 45 minutes. She was late to her 11 o'clock class. She apologized to her students with zero actual remorse and taught one of the best lectures of the semester because she was energized in the specific way that comes from an argument you loved having even when, especially when, it is unresolved. He picked her up for dinner on Friday night. Not the Grand Joseon. A small, family-run Korean soul food fusion spot in Vine City called Bap and Butter, the kind of place that had 6 tables and a playlist that moved between Sam Cooke and BTS without any sense of irony, because the owner, Mississippi Celestine Park, had married a Korean man 30 years ago and built the menu of their life together and served it to the neighborhood at $28 a head. Jae-won had been coming here since he was 22, back when the empire was being built and Miss Celestine had fed him galbi and collard greens without asking questions and that had mattered in ways he never fully articulated. Susan ordered the sundubu jjigae, soft tofu stew, and asked Miss Celestine about the recipe with the genuine curiosity of someone who wants to understand a thing, not just consume it, and Miss Celestine looked at Jae-won with an expression he had never seen directed at him across this particular table before. Approval. The warm, complicated kind. On the drive home, Susan asked him again what he did. Not the way she'd asked at the Grand Joseon, which had been polite. This time it was direct, and her voice had a different quality, the quality of a woman who has been paying attention and wants an honest accounting. He drove for a moment in silence. Something complicated, he said. I teach literature for a living, she said. I'm fluent in complicated. The kind of complicated that has, he paused, searching for the word that was accurate without being a confession, wait. The kind that doesn't leave. She was quiet for a long time, looking out the window at the city sliding past. Atlanta at night had a particular beauty that was also a particular sadness, the glitter of new construction over old neighborhoods, the way a city can be simultaneously rising and mourning itself. I know what you are, she said, finally. Not accusing. Not afraid. Just honest. I'm not a naive woman, Jae-won. I grew up in this city. I have eyes. I know you do. So I need you to understand, she said, turning to look at him, that if I choose to spend time with you, I'm doing it with full information. Not because I've been charmed into not seeing clearly. I see clearly. I'm choosing anyway. And I need to know that you understand what that means, because it means I'm trusting you to be straight with me. Always. Not everything. I'm not asking for everything. But straight. He looked at her. The traffic light ahead of them turned red and he stopped the car and just looked at her in the red glow, and she looked back at him, and the city hummed around them with its beautiful, complicated life. Always, he said. He meant it. That, in retrospect, was the most dangerous thing he said. They saw each other 4 times in the first 2 weeks. Always carefully, always varied, different locations, never his regular places except Bap and Butter, which had the additional security of Miss Celestine's complete and absolute discretion built over 30 years of feeding people who needed to be unseen. He was careful. He was professional about being careful, because that was the only mode he knew for anything that mattered. He varied his routes. He was meticulous about who knew. But here is the thing about trying to be invisible in a city where you are, fundamentally, visible, you can control what you do. You cannot control what other people see and file away and eventually sell. It was Dominic who brought him the intelligence, 12 days in, sitting across his desk in the office above the legitimate importing business in Cabbagetown that served as a meeting space, a building full of Korean ceramics and West African textiles and shipping manifests that were entirely real and an organizational network that was not, and laid a photograph on the desk. Jae-won's car. Outside Susan's building in Midtown. Taken from across the street. Reyes's people, Dominic said. They've had eyes on you since the dinner hall. Jae-won looked at the photograph for a long moment. They know who she is? Not yet. They have the car and the building. They're working on it. Dominic sat down across from him. Jae-won. She's a civilian. A professor. She has no protection, no infrastructure, no understanding of what being identified as yours means. He said the word yours carefully, because it was a word he had never had occasion to use in this context before. If Reyes decides she's a useful lever. He won't. How do you know that? Because before he decides that, Jae-won said, very quietly, I'll remove the reason. He looked up from the photograph. Pull back. I need 3 days. Dominic looked at him. 3 days to do what, exactly? Jae-won didn't answer. And this is the part of the story where something predictable was about to happen, where the rational calculation was clear, where every rule he had built his survival on said the same thing, loudly and without ambiguity. End it. End it now, cleanly, before it costs what it's about to cost. She is 12 days into your life and she is already a photograph on your enemy's desk. This is what should have happened. What actually happened was that he called his mother. Now. You need to understand Park Soo-yeon before you can understand why this was either the bravest or the most insane thing Kang Jae-won had ever done, and these are not mutually exclusive categories. Park Soo-yeon was 62 years old, 5 feet 2 inches tall, and operated with the quiet, absolute authority of a woman who had survived things that would have unmade lesser people and emerged with her dignity not just intact but reinforced. She had come to the United States from Busan, South Korea, at 26, with a toddler Jae-won in one arm and a suitcase in the other and more capability in her body than most people develop in a lifetime. She had worked 3 jobs in Atlanta while her son grew up, cleaned offices and cooked in a restaurant kitchen, and eventually, through a combination of ferocious intelligence and the complete refusal to be defeated by circumstance, built a small but successful catering business that she ran from her Alpharetta home with 6 employees and a reputation that meant she was fully booked 8 months in advance. She knew what her son was. She had known for years. She had made her peace with it in the complicated, anguished, practical way that mothers make peace with the things their children become, not endorsing, not condemning, but loving with the full information of who he was, because love that requires ignorance is not love, it's comfort. She had said this to him once, directly, and he had not been able to respond, and she had patted his hand and gone back to her cooking, because Park Soo-yeon expressed most of her deepest truths through food and most of her deepest hopes through showing up unannounced. He called her on a Tuesday evening. He was standing in his kitchen, which was the kind of kitchen that had every appliance and almost no food because he ordered in constantly and had the eating habits of a man who feeds his body as fuel rather than as pleasure. He called her because he had 3 days to make a decision, and he had found, in the last 12 days, that there was one person whose judgment he trusted completely and one direction in which he had never told a deliberate lie. "Iyama," he said. "Mom." Jae-won. Her voice. The specific frequency of it. The one that had been the first sound he remembered and remained, somehow, the one that cut cleanest through every layer of everything he had built. "Mwo hey? What are you doing? I need to tell you something." There was a pause. Not a worried pause. A listening pause. His mother knew the difference between his voices. She had been cataloging them for 32 years. "Tell me," she said. He told her. Not everything. But honestly, which, for Kang Jae-won, was the same as everything, because he had long ago decided that partial honesty with his mother was an insult to both of them. He told her about the dinner hall and the woman reading the book and the 12 days and the photograph on his desk and the decision he was supposed to make. Soo-yeon was quiet for a long time when he finished. "This woman," she said. "Susanna. Susan. Susan Williams. Susan. She knows what you are. She knows enough. Does she know about the photograph?" "Not yet." Another quiet. "Jae-won, she said, and her voice had the texture it got when she was about to say something that would stay with him longer than he expected. "The reason you built all of this," she meant the empire, the walls, the distance, the architecture of untouchability, "was not because you wanted to be powerful. It was because you wanted to be safe. Because when we came here, we were not safe, and you learned that the only way to be safe was to need nothing. Require nothing. Want nothing." A pause. "You have been very safe, and completely alone, for a very long time." He didn't say anything. "I want to meet her," Soo-yeon said. "Iyama. Not negotiating. I want to meet her." And then, with the particular brand of Korean maternal sarcasm that Jae-won had spent 32 years being unable to counter, "If you're going to burn everything down, I should at least see who for." He didn't pull back from Susan. Instead, he did something that was either a masterstroke or a catastrophic miscalculation and possibly both at the same time. He told her about Reyes. Not everything about Reyes. But enough. Enough to say, "There is a man who may attempt to use you as leverage against me, and I need you to understand what that means in practical terms, and I need you to decide, with full information, whether you want to continue this." He sat across from her in bap and butter on a Wednesday evening and put the information on the table between them, plainly, the way she had asked him to, and watched her face. Susan listened without interrupting. She had a stillness when she was processing something serious, not the stillness of shock, but the stillness of a woman who thinks before she speaks and considers that a discipline, not a hesitation. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, turning her tea glass in her hands. "So you're telling me," she said, "that continuing to see you may result in me becoming a bargaining chip for organized crime?" "Yes." "And you're telling me this because?" "Because I told you I would be straight with you." "And because," he stopped. Started again. "Because you deserve the choice." Made clearly. She looked at him for a long time. "What would pulling back look like?" she asked. "Honestly. I disappear," he said. "You go back to your life exactly as it was. No contact. I handle the Reyes situation. In 6 months, the photograph is irrelevant because there's nothing to find." "And what does that cost you?" He was quiet. Jae-won. "Something I didn't know I had until 12 days ago," he said. She set down her tea glass. "I need 3 days," she said. He almost laughed. "I said the same thing this morning." "Then we're both thinking people," she said. "Good. That should be useful later." He did laugh then, a short, genuine sound that surprised him slightly, because it felt like something that had been stored somewhere under a lot of concrete. She called him in 2 days, not 3. She called him from her office between her 9 and 11 o'clock, eating a breakfast sandwich, and she said, "I've thought about it." And I think," she said, carefully, "that I have spent a significant portion of my adult life being excellent and safe and making decisions that optimize for outcomes I can control. And I think that has been, a pause, productive. And also, possibly, a little bit of a cage." "Susan. I'm not finished." "A beat. I'm not choosing this because I'm reckless. I'm choosing it because I'm paying attention, and what I'm paying attention to is real. And I've decided that real things are worth the risk of real consequences." Another pause. "Also, you were genuinely wrong about Baldwin and I need at least 6 more conversations to adequately demonstrate this. If you are going to risk your safety to continue arguing about James Baldwin with me." "I'm risking my safety to continue," she stopped. Rephrased. "I'm staying because I want to. The Baldwin is just a bonus." He told Dominic that evening. Dominic was silent for 4 full seconds, which was significant because Dominic was not a man who used silence casually. Then he said, "Okay. Then we need to talk about her security." "Agreed. And we need to talk about the Reyes situation." "Also agreed. And I need you to understand," Dominic said, "that I am both professionally and personally going to need you to not look at her the way you did in the dinner hall in any room that contains people who want to kill you, because that look is a loaded weapon pointed at both of you." "I'm aware." "You didn't look aware. You looked," Dominic searched for the word, "human. In a room full of people who will absolutely exploit that." "I know, Dominic. I'm just saying. Work on the face." Here is the part where the story should have found its groove. Where the two of them navigated towards something careful and sustainable. Where they met in the space between his world and hers and built something that worked. Here is the part where that didn't happen yet. If you've been watching this story from the beginning and this is your first time on the channel, please take a second to subscribe right now and tap the notification bell. These stories go long, they go deep, and you do not want to miss what's coming in the next 20 minutes, because what Jae-won's mother does next changes absolutely everything. Subscribe. We'll be here. It was Park Soo-yeon who called Susan first. Not through Jae-won. Directly. She had gotten Susan's number from her son under what could charitably be described as an interrogation and what Jae-won would later describe, privately, to Dominic, as a 17-minute negotiation that was somehow more exhausting than the Castillo deal. Soo-yeon called Susan on a Saturday morning, introduced herself in English that was precise and warm and carried the particular music of a language learned with care rather than born into, and said, "I would like to have lunch with you. Just us. I think this will be better than waiting for my son to arrange it, because my son will take 6 months to arrange it and I have things I would like to say before 6 months." Susan, who had been briefed on Soo-yeon by Jae-won in the way people brief others on weather systems, significant, directional, cannot be redirected, best approached with appropriate preparation, said, "I'd like that." They met at a Korean restaurant in Doraville, not Alpharetta, because Soo-yeon had driven to meet Susan halfway, which Susan noted and filed away. The restaurant was family-run, cramped, loud, and served banchan, the small side dishes that Korean meals begin with, in an array that made Susan's eyes go wide, because there were 14 of them, small ceramic dishes covering the entire table before a single main dish appeared. "You've had Korean food before?" Soo-yeon asked. "Some," Susan said. "Not like this. This is real Korean food. Restaurant Korean food is a performance. Home Korean food is a conversation." She gestured at the banchan. "Try the kimchi first. It tells you everything about the kitchen." Susan tried the kimchi. It was extraordinary. She said so, sincerely, and Soo-yeon looked at her with an expression that recalibrated slightly, a shift from assessment to something warmer. They talked for 3 hours. Soo-yeon asked her, directly and without apology, about her work. Her research. Her family. Her understanding of what she was stepping into. She asked these questions not as an interrogation but as a woman who takes information seriously and believes that the people around the people she loves should be known clearly. Susan answered each one with the same direct clarity she brought to everything, and she asked her own questions in return, about Jae-won as a child, about the journey from Busan to Atlanta, about the catering business, about what it had meant to build something in a language and a country that weren't initially hers. "He is not easy," Soo-yeon said, at one point, setting down her chopsticks in the deliberate way of someone arriving at the essential thing. "My son. He has not allowed himself to be known for a very long time. He knows how to be useful. He knows how to be powerful. He does not always know how to be present. As a person." She looked at Susan directly. "But he called me about you. He has never called me about a person. In 32 years, I have never received that call." Susan absorbed this. "I'm not going to fix him," Susan said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not in this to be anyone's turning point. I'm in it because it's real and because he treats me like I'm real, and that's," she paused, and something passed across her face briefly, something honest and slightly unguarded, "that's rarer than it should be." Soo-yeon was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her chopsticks, served Susan a piece of galbi from the shared plate, and said, "Good answer." Which, from Park Soo-yeon, was not a small thing. She did not tell Jae-won what they had discussed. She texted him afterward a single message, "She's good. Don't ruin it." He stared at this message for a long time. He texted back, "Thank you, Yama." She sent him a rice cake emoji and went back to her cooking. The Reyes situation escalated before any of them were ready for it to. It happened on a Thursday night, 3 weeks after the Grand Joseon, and it began not with violence but with the specific, calculated move of a man who understands leverage. Reyes sent a message through channels, not to Jae-won directly, because direct communication would require acknowledging the power dynamic explicitly and Reyes was not ready to do that, but to a middleman in Charlotte, who passed it to another middleman in Macon, who ultimately delivered it to Dominic in the form of a hand-delivered envelope containing a single photograph. Susan. Walking across the Spelman campus. Her face clearly visible. The Spelman ID she wore while on campus clearly visible. Her building, her classroom window, her car in the faculty lot. Nothing threatening in text. Just information, arranged as a demonstration of access. Dominic brought it to Jae-won at 9 in the morning. Jae-won looked at it for a long time without speaking. He's testing the response, Dominic said. Wants to know if she's real leverage or if we minimize it. What are our options? Standard options. Dominic said this carefully, because standard options in their world covered a significant range. Or we change the calculus. Make her difficult to touch, not by removing her, but by making the cost of touching her prohibitively high. How high can we make it? Depends on what you're willing to spend. Jae-won stood up and walked to the window of the Cabbagetown office, looking down at the street below. People moving through their morning, coffee cups, briefcases, the ordinary beautiful machinery of civilian life. Susan was on that campus right now, probably teaching, probably arguing with a student about something important, probably eating a breakfast sandwich. Everything, he said. Spend everything. Dominic nodded. Just once. Okay. Then we need to talk about Reyes. I know. And about the Park group from Charlotte. They're connected. I know that too. And, Dominic hesitated. This was notable. Dominic Yoon, in 11 years, had not hesitated before delivering information. There's one more thing. Reyes has been in communication with the Bianchi people. This isn't just about the Piedmont territory anymore. He's building a coalition. Jae-won turned from the window. Against me. Against you specifically. And, another hesitation, using the perception of vulnerability. What happened at the dinner hall? Confirmed and amplified. So in their reading, Jae-won said slowly, I walked across a room and threw away everything I was because a woman was reading a book, and that means I'm weak. That's the read. Jae-won was quiet for a moment. Then, they're not wrong that something changed. They're wrong about what it means. Then we need to show them what it means. Yes, Jae-won said. We do. What happened next was the part that the Reyes coalition did not anticipate, because it operated on an assumption that had been correct for 17 years, that Kang Jae-won's power came from isolation. That the architecture of his untouchability was built on having nothing to protect. They had not accounted for the possibility that having something to protect makes a man more dangerous, not less. That the specific quality of danger changes when it becomes personal. That a man who has been operating at 90% of his capacity for 17 years because he has been careful, measured, strategic, deliberately restrained, is a different and considerably more terrifying thing when he stops being restrained. He called Castillo first. Not to renegotiate. To consolidate. The Piedmont deal had already closed and Castillo, despite sweating through his shirt at the Grand Josian, was a businessman who understood the value of being on the winning side of a changing calculation. Jae-won offered him a protection arrangement that made the 24% look like a minor transaction, and Castillo, who was not a stupid man, recognized what he was being offered and signed within 48 hours. He called the Park group from Charlotte second, which surprised them, because you don't call people who are building a coalition against you, you respond to them, which keeps them in the position of initiative. Calling them directly, first, before they moved, reorganized the entire dynamic. He laid out, precisely, what he knew about their communications with Reyes and the Bianchi people, which was everything, because Dominic Yoon had spent 11 years building an intelligence network that the people in that coalition had severely underestimated. The Charlotte meeting ended with two families stepping away from Reyes's coalition within a week. Reyes, stripped of two of his three coalition partners, was left with the Bianchi connection and a dramatically diminished hand. He was also left with the knowledge that his information campaign, the photograph, the narrative of vulnerability, had backfired in a way that had strengthened the man he'd been trying to weaken. Dominic delivered the final assessment on a Monday evening. Reyes is contained. The coalition is gone. He doesn't have the resources to move independently and he knows it. And the photograph? Susan? She's clear. Our people have had eyes on the campus and her building since the envelope. Nothing's moved in her direction. Dominic paused. She doesn't know about any of this. No. Are you going to tell her? Jae-won thought about the promise he had made, sitting across from her in bap and butter in the red light of a traffic signal. Always. Yes, he said. He told her on a Friday evening, at her apartment in Midtown, which was full of books in a way that could only be described as intentional, books on every surface including the kitchen counter in a way that suggested they weren't just decorative, they were active, all of them, simultaneously, in various states of being read and considered and argued with. Her apartment looked like the inside of a very good mind. He had noticed this the first time he'd come here and had found it, quietly and privately, one of the most remarkable things he'd seen in a very long time. He told her about the photograph and Reyes and the coalition and everything he had done in the 3 weeks since. He told her plainly, clearly, without softening anything. He told her about what Dominic had called the security arrangement, which meant that there had been people watching over her without her knowledge, and he told her this knowing that this part, specifically, was going to be the difficult part. She listened without interrupting. The full, serious stillness she brought to important things. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Long enough that he couldn't read it. People were watching me, she said. On my campus. Without telling me. Yes. For 3 weeks. Yes. She stood up and walked to her kitchen window, which looked out over Midtown Atlanta, the city below them doing its Friday evening thing, full of ordinary life and movement and the specific joy of a city that doesn't know or care about the architecture of your anxiety. I understand why, she said, after a long moment. I understand the operational logic of not telling me in real time. She turned around. Her face was complicated, not angry, not quite, but something adjacent to it, something honest and unresolved. But Jae-won. I told you. Straight. That was my requirement. Not comfortable. Straight. I know. And you made a decision about my safety without. I made a decision about your safety that I stand by, he said. Not defensive. Clear. If telling you in real time had put you at additional risk through your response, would do it the same way again. That's not me choosing to deceive you. It's me choosing to protect you over being transparent in a moment when transparency was a tactical liability. She was quiet. That's not the same thing, he said. I know the difference, she said. I'm not saying you were wrong. A pause. I'm saying I'm adjusting my understanding of what straight means in the context of your world. And I need a moment to do that adjustment without you explaining it to me. He sat down on her couch and waited. He was, in fact, very good at waiting. It was one of the few things that required patience that he had mastered completely. She came back from the window after 4 minutes. Sat down across from him. Looked at him. Okay, she said. I've adjusted. That's it? I'm a practical woman. A small, dry smile. Also, I have a question. Ask. This Reyes person. Is he handled? He's contained. Contained meaning? Meaning he doesn't have the resources or the allies to move in any direction right now. He's a problem that has been sufficiently reduced. And in 6 months? Monitored. Managed. He met her eyes. You are not in danger. That is the truth. She considered him for a moment. Then, okay. She reached over to the side table and picked up a book. Not a dismissal, she handed it to him. While you were out there being terrifying on my behalf, I finished this. I've marked 3 passages that are directly relevant to the Baldwin argument. We're going back in. He looked at the book. He looked at her. Now? You said you'd be here at 7. It's 7:15. That's already 15 minutes of argument I've been waiting to have. She settled back into her corner of the couch with the complete comfort of someone fully at home. Start with the first marked passage. Page 47. He opened to page 47. And this is the thing that Dominic Yoon would later try to explain to 3 different people who asked him about Kang Jae-won in the years that followed, and that he could never quite land accurately in language. It wasn't that the woman softened him. It wasn't that love made him less dangerous or less himself. It was that Susan Williams was the first person in 17 years who engaged with him without the fear-shaped distortion that everyone else carried into the room. Who saw him directly, without the mythology in the way, and chose to stay. And being seen directly, being chosen without the mythology, that did something to a man that was less like softening and more like recalibration. Like coming into focus. He read the marked passage. You're still wrong, he said. Page 47 clearly states. The author is discussing the external manifestation of internal rupture, not. I know what the author is discussing, I assigned the book. Then you should know that assigned reading and comprehension are not the same. Kang Jae-won, I have a PhD. In literature, not in being right. And that, at 7:16 on a Friday evening in a midtown Atlanta apartment surrounded by an absolutely unreasonable number of books, was what it actually sounded like. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Just real. Warm and sharp and full of the specific life of 2 people who had decided that the other one was worth the considerable inconvenience of being genuinely known. Now. Back to 7:43 in the morning, 2 weeks after this, which is where we started. Back to Park Soo-yeon in the foyer, the doenjang jjigae on the entryway table, Susan Williams in Jae-won's Oxford shirt doing something that could only be described as existing very comfortably in a space that was not supposed to admit comfort. Jae-won emerged from the bedroom in a state that could charitably be described as not fully assembled. He was in sweatpants and a t-shirt, which was such an aberration from his normal presentation that Dominic, had he been present, would have needed to sit down. He turned the corner into the living room, saw Susan in the armchair looking at him with that clear, composed, slightly amused expression, then turned toward the kitchen, where his mother was already moving through his refrigerator with the focused displeasure of a woman encountering a spiritual failure. "Iyama," he said, his voice carrying all the authority of a man who runs 400 miles of eastern seaboard territory and approximately none of that authority in this kitchen. "Wei waso. Why did you come?" His mother turned from the refrigerator holding a container of leftover delivery that she examined the way forensic investigators examine evidence. She looked at him. Then she looked toward the living room, which was toward Susan. Then she looked back at him with an expression that communicated, without a single word, a complete and thorough accounting of her feelings about everything she had walked into. "Bap miojiatsio," she said. "Have you eaten?" "That is not." "The refrigerator is empty," she said, setting down the delivery container with the finality of a ruling. "You have an empty refrigerator and a woman in your shirt reading a book in your living room." A pause. "I brought jjigae." She picked up the container she'd brought and began setting it on the stove with the decisive movements of a woman who has decided to be useful as a coping mechanism. "Iyama. Go get dressed. You look like someone who gave up." Jae-won stood in his kitchen doorway for a moment in what could only be described as a controlled implosion of dignity. Then he turned and walked back toward the bedroom, passing the living room, and Susan looked up from her book as he passed and her face was doing an extremely precise job of not showing how much she was enjoying this. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said, with the gravity of a man who is saving all available processing power for whatever was about to happen in his kitchen. "Your mother," Susan said, conversationally, "is already reorganizing your spice cabinet." He looked toward the kitchen. He could hear it happening. He looked back at Susan. She raised her eyebrows slightly. He went to get dressed. Soo-yeon had the jjigae heating by the time he returned, and had additionally located a container of rice in the pantry that she regarded as marginally acceptable and put on to cook, and had reorganized the top 2 shelves of the refrigerator on the grounds that the organizational system he had been using was, in her assessment, a philosophical error. She had also, in the living room doorway, paused and looked at Susan for a long moment. "You found the cereal," she said. "I did," Susan said. "I hope that was okay. The bowls are in the cabinet above the dishwasher. He keeps them too high." "That's what I thought," Susan said. Soo-yeon looked at her. A long, measuring look that was also, underneath the measuring, something else. Something that had been building since the phone call in Doraville and the lunch in the restaurant and everything she had assessed from the careful distance of a mother watching her son finally, after a very long time, step towards something that was not power or strategy or control but just life. "Come eat," she said, in English. Not to Jae-won. To Susan. Susan closed her book, carefully marking her page, and came to the kitchen table. And here is what that looked like. 3 people at a kitchen table in a Buckhead penthouse on an early Atlanta morning, the city below them waking up and going about its enormous ordinary life. Doenjang jjigae steaming in ceramic bowls. Rice. The small banchan that Soo-yeon had produced seemingly from the Louis Vuitton tote like a magician, because Park Soo-yeon did not go anywhere without contingency food. Susan Williams asking, sincerely, about the fermentation process of doenjang because she was genuinely curious, and Soo-yeon, who did not perform knowledge but simply had it, explaining with the particular warmth of a person sharing something they love to someone paying real attention. And Jae-won, sitting between his mother and this woman who had walked into the Grand Joseon 3 weeks ago and stood the architecture of his life on its head simply by reading a book and telling him he was blocking her light. Eating his mother's food in his own kitchen for the first time in years. Watching these 2 women talk, 2 different kinds of formidable, 2 different cultural inheritances, 2 entirely different relationships to the city they'd both made their home, and feeling something that he did not have a word for in Korean or English or any of the other languages that business had made him fluent in. It wasn't happiness, exactly. It was more specific than that. It was the feeling of a man who has been very good at everything and very alone in everything, and who is sitting, for the first time, in something that is both full and real, and who is aware, in the same moment, of how much this costs and how completely he doesn't care about the cost. Soo-yeon asked Susan, at one point, what she was reading. Susan described the book, a collection of essays about cultural memory and inheritance, how communities carry their histories in their bodies before they carry them in their documents. She described it with the natural fluency of someone who lives inside ideas, and Soo-yeon listened and then said, quietly, in Korean we say, nunchi. The sense of reading a room. Feeling what is not said. A pause. I think what you describe is the opposite. The things that are always being said, even when no one is speaking. Susan looked at her for a moment. That's exactly it, she said. Soo-yeon picked up her spoon. Said nothing more. But she served Susan a second bowl. Jae-won looked at his mother over the table. She didn't look back at him. She was talking to Susan about the catering business, about the menu evolution over 30 years, about the moment she had first put galbi and collard greens on the same plate and the look on the first customer's face, which had been confusion followed immediately by recognition. The recognition of 2 things that belonged together that nobody had thought to put together before. Jae-won looked at Susan. She caught his eye, briefly, over his mother's head. Her expression was the composed, clear, slightly warm thing that it usually was, but with something underneath it that was also, he had come to understand, just for him. Not performed for the room. Just his. He had spent 17 years building walls so comprehensive that nothing could get in. He had been, in the architectural sense, impeccable. Every vulnerability removed. Every attachment filed away before it could grow into a pressure point. He had not accounted for a woman who peeled grapes and read books and told him he was blocking her light and then chose, with full information, to stay in it anyway. He had not accounted for his mother deciding, in her very particular and completely unstoppable way, to simply integrate this new reality as though she had been expecting it and was merely annoyed it had taken this long. He had not accounted for the possibility that the thing that ended his mythology as an untouchable ghost was not a rival's move or a federal case or any of the 1,000 operational risks he had managed for 17 years. It was this. 3 people at a kitchen table. Doenjang jjigae steaming. An Atlanta morning coming through the windows. 2 women having a real conversation about cultural memory and 30-year-old recipes and what it means to carry a history in your body. It was the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to him, and it was the only thing in 17 years that felt like it was worth the danger. Later, weeks later, months into a thing that had become so thoroughly real it had its own gravity, Susan would ask him about that moment in the kitchen. They were in Bap and Butter, because they went to Bap and Butter regularly now, because Miss Celestine had adopted Susan with a warmth and completeness that suggested she had been waiting for this specific woman to walk into her restaurant for quite some time. Susan asked him what he had been thinking, sitting there that morning. He was quiet for a moment. In the way he went quiet when he was going to say something that cost him something. I was thinking, he said, that I had spent 17 years being very effective and entirely, he paused, looking for the word, sealed. And I had called that safety. He looked at her. And I was thinking that morning that safety and sealed are not the same thing, and I had confused them for a very long time. She was quiet. And I was thinking, he continued, that my mother was going to reorganize my entire kitchen and I was not going to stop her because watching her talk to you was the first time in my adult life that my kitchen felt like it was supposed to have people in it. Susan looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her chopsticks and served him a piece of galbi, because she had also been coming here long enough to know how to use chopsticks for this specific purpose, which Miss Celestine had observed on the 3rd visit and commented on with considerable satisfaction. You were also thinking, Susan said, that you were still right about Baldwin. I was also thinking that I was still right about Baldwin. You're not. Susan. You're really not. I have reread the relevant passages 4 times. Reading something 4 times incorrectly is just 4 times wrong. That is not how reading works. Miss Celestine came to their table to refill the water, looked at both of them, and said, to no one in particular, Lord, they're still doing this, and went back to the kitchen shaking her head with the warm, unsuppressed delight of a woman watching exactly what she wanted to see. In a city that moved fast and forgot slow, in a world that punished attachment and rewarded isolation, 2 people had found each other in the middle of a dinner hall where everyone was afraid, and had chosen, against every strategic calculation, to be seen. And Park Soo-yeon, who had driven 40 minutes at sunrise with a container of doenjang jjigae because she'd had a dream and a mother's instinct and 32 years of watching her son be exceptional and alone, Park Soo-yeon had simply walked through the front door and started cooking. Which is, when you think about it, what she had always done. And somewhere on the Piedmont corridor, in the quiet aftermath of a reorganized coalition and a man who had demonstrated that the architecture of his power had not collapsed but transformed, Kang Jae-won, the architect of Ash, was learning a different kind of building. Not walls. Not distance. Something harder to construct and significantly more difficult to destroy. Before this story ends, and it is ending now, not because this is where they stop but because this is where they begin, which in some stories is the same thing, there is one more moment you need. It happened on a Sunday, 6 weeks after the Grand Joseon. A morning in Alpharetta, at Soo-yeon's house, which was warm and full of the smell of cooking and the kind of organized abundance that a woman builds when she has spent years building safety through nourishment. Susan had been invited, by Soo-yeon directly, who sent the invitation via text with a specificity that suggested the menu had already been planned. Jae-won arrived first, because he always arrived first everywhere, and stood in his mother's kitchen while she cooked and she talked at him in the way she talked at him, the mixture of Korean and English that was the language of their particular family, commentary and instruction and observation moving fluidly between the two. She makes you nervous, Soo-yeon said, stirring something on the stove, not looking at him. She doesn't make me nervous. She makes you honest, which makes you nervous. He was quiet. This is good, Soo-yeon said. Nervous means you're paying attention. When you stop being nervous you stop trying. She paused. Your father stopped being nervous. Jams him on. Don't be your father. This was said simply and without cruelty, because Soo-yeon had long ago processed the grief of her marriage into something that could be stated plainly and used as instruction. Jae-won absorbed it in the same way, as fact, as orientation, as the specific kind of maternal love that trusts you with the real version of things. Susan arrived at 11, with a bottle of wine that she had researched specifically to complement Korean food because that was the kind of attention she brought to things, and a book for Soo-yeon, an essay collection she had mentioned over the phone that she hadn't read, wrapped carefully, because Susan Williams believed that bringing a book to someone was one of the highest forms of regard. Soo-yeon opened the book, looked at the table of contents, nodded once, and said, "Sit." Which meant welcome, in the language she used for the people she had decided mattered. They ate lunch for 2 hours. The conversation moved between Korean food history and African American literary tradition and Atlanta neighborhood change and the particular shared experience of being women who built things in a country that hadn't fully prepared for them, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, the two of them had stopped performing the careful courtesy of new acquaintance and were simply talking, directly and with the ease of people who recognize something in each other that they don't have to explain. Jae-won sat at his mother's table and said almost nothing. He didn't need to. He watched the two women who were, in their completely different ways, the most formidable people he knew, and he felt the specific, quiet weight of a man sitting inside something real. His mother caught his eye at one point, while Susan was describing a student's research project with the natural animation she brought to other people's intellectual work. Soo-yeon's expression was composed, as it usually was. But her eyes said, yes. This one. Finally. He said nothing back. Just held her gaze for a moment. It was enough. Because here is the truth about power, the kind that Kang Jae-won had spent 17 years building and had always believed was the only kind that counted. It is real. It protects. It creates outcomes. It turns problems into history. But there is a different kind. The kind that walks into a dinner hall and reads a book in a gold dress and tells a myth that he is blocking her light. The kind that chooses, with full information, to stay. The kind that shows up at sunrise with doenjang jjigae and reorganizes a refrigerator and cooks for 3 people in a kitchen that was never supposed to hold anyone. The kind that looks across a table at a man who has been sealed for 17 years and sees, clearly and without flinching, the person underneath all of it. That kind is harder to build and impossible to take. And in Atlanta, in the specific geography of a city that has always known something about rising from ash, Kang Jae-won, the architect of ash, was building both kinds at once. One with his organization, his strategy, his carefully managed empire that ran on intelligence and consequence. One with a woman who had never been impressed by him, which was the only reason she could see him clearly. One with his mother, who had always known this was coming and had simply been waiting, with the patience of a woman who feeds stress and shows up unannounced and loves her son with the full information of who he is. The city hummed. It always hummed. Atlanta was like that, full of its own enormous life, its highways and history and the beautiful, complicated machinery of a place that holds contradictions without resolving them because some contradictions are just the texture of being real. Kang Jae-won drove home that Sunday evening with Susan in the passenger seat, the windows open, Atlanta in the early autumn doing what it did, warm still, but with the first suggestion of the season turning, the air carrying a slight edge that wasn't there last week. She was reading. She had brought a book to his mother's house and she had a book now, in the car, held up in the last of the afternoon light. She did this. She always had a book. He had stopped finding this remarkable and had started finding it simply true, which is what happens when you stop being amazed by someone and start being familiar with them, and familiarity, real familiarity, the earned kind, is the only intimacy that actually lasts. "What are you reading?" he asked. She showed him the cover without looking up. Another diaspora text. Another academic conversation he was going to be asked to have an opinion on. He was already forming the opinion. I'm going to disagree with at least 2 of those chapters, he said. I'm counting on it, she said. The city moved around them, full of its life. In his pocket, his phone had 3 messages from Dominic that he would read when he got home and handle tomorrow, because tomorrow was a business day and tonight was something else entirely. In Alpharetta, his mother was washing the dishes from a Sunday lunch that had lasted 2 hours longer than planned and texting her catering staff about Tuesday's delivery order and feeling, in the specific interior weather of Park Soo-yeon, something that was quiet and warm and very like relief. In a restaurant on Peachtree Road, Miss Celestine was closing up for the night, turning off the lights over the tables, singing something to herself in the particular register of a woman who is satisfied with how her Sunday went. And in the passenger seat of an impossible man's car, Dr. Susan Williams turned a page. If you have stayed with this story all the way to the end, and if you're hearing these words, you have, then you already know what this channel is about. It's not about perfection. It's not about easy. It is about real things, found in unlikely places, chosen with full information, held onto anyway. If that is your kind of story, subscribe right now. Leave a comment below, tell me which moment in this story hit you the hardest. Was it the dinner hall? Was it Soo-yeon walking through the door? Was it Susan saying, "I'm choosing anyway"? Tell me. Because these stories are built for you, and I want to know which parts of them find you. Subscribe. Comment. We'll see you next time.